Today's session, Hong Kong and Malaysia, a Poetics of Relations, will be joined by Assistant Professor in the School of Chinese at the University of Hong Kong, Dr. Nicholas Y.H. Wong, who will present on the significance behind the historical exchanges between Hong Kong and various regions of Malaysia in literature, culture, and economy. Dr. Wong was also previously a postdoctoral fellow with the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at the University of Hong Kong. Please leave your questions throughout this presentations in the chat box. Once again, they may be addressed at the end of this session. And without further ado, I would like to turn my time over to Dr. Wong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for introducing me. And thank you to the Center for Heritage Arts and Textile and the Executive Director, Takahashi Mizuki, and Bruce and Eugenia for putting this together and inviting me to share some of my ideas as part of the illustrious lineup of speakers, and of course in dialogue with Yilan's exhibition. I'm so honored to be here. So Bruce gave you a short introduction to my academic work. I'll just add by saying, when I'm not writing my academic essays, I write poetry, and I often get inspired by artworks, by literature, and by history. I also teach translation at the University of Hong Kong, and I wonder about the dynamics of facilitating communication. So there's this in-between aspect of what's, figuring out what's possible in specific media and genres. So for today, to connect with our artist Yilan's concerns with indigenous labor and textile making, I will talk about labor, specifically the intertwined histories of labor and art making. I'll focus on literature, which I'm more familiar with, of course. So labor is not limited to manual labor, but also extended to artistic labor and emotional labor. So things that are not necessarily valued, not necessarily seen. So I will look out for processes of making and producing, not just for the global economy and for other people's consumption halfway around the world without knowing who uses it, the product or commodity, but also a making and labor directed to oneself, so for one's own sustenance and self-sufficiency. So for example, you would think of the history of smallholder plantations of ex-slaves and ex-workers of Javanese plantation estates in East Sumatra, Indonesia, or other regions like the Caribbean. So indeed, how do writers conceptualize this relationship between the self and the world, between national colonial forces and their migrant and indigenous sense of self-sufficiency and survival? So to discuss this relationship of making for other people, but also making for oneself, I will use Chinese language writing and translation projects from Hong Kong and Malaysia, and more broadly, Southeast Asia as my examples. But first is a map on the bottom right hand of your screen, just to give you a sense of where Hong Kong is, where Malaysia is, where they are in relation to one another. It's a really beautiful rainbow colorful map to show you the region as it's delineated now, the national boundaries, right? So in this presentation, I'll use the word Mahwah. You might ask, what is Mahwah? It stands for Malaysian Chinese or ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. The word Chinese, Hua, is quite vague. It sometimes refers to Chinese ethnicity, but not exclusively so. It can also refer to Chinese language writing and literature. So this vagueness is part of how Mahwah writers have envisioned themselves and their world. This unresolved tension of identity is a key feature in the setting and characters of Mahwah literature. So this is basically my field of study, and I'm extracting a couple of insights that I have gleaned from the text I've read so far. So to give you an outline of today's talk, I'll I will start off with a quote by Liu Yichang or Liu Yichang to demonstrate a popular imagination of Liu in world literature. And I'll explain some theory, so some words such as Poetics of Relation and Inter-Imperiality. And then I'll move on to talk about colonial economy. So I'll give a background of Malaya as a colonial economy and show the emergence of Chinese language writing within this space. I'll talk about the history of the coolie trade. And now a disclaimer, right? The word coolie is used to refer to contract laborers from China and India with harmful intentions. But I use the word here to refer to the historical scholarship on the coolie trade that happens between empires. Okay, so why do I frame my reading of literature as thus? I'm rather interested in the case studies of the Delhi plantation estates in East Sumatra recently, so I'll talk a little bit about that. And it's interesting because when Chinese laborers ended up in Delhi, they had to go through Malaya as a transit port. And so, I'm thinking of Hong Kong and Malaya not just as spaces of departure and settlement, but also spaces of transit, right? Spaces of that receive and also give out. So they are nodes in a global colonial economy, right? There's a lot of movement in and out. So I'm trying to think of the history of labor as parallel to or also intersecting with the history of art making. And so intersecting in ways where writers write about histories of labor, but also convey histories of labor through their style, or they are themselves part of the laboring class. Okay, next I'll talk about some translation projects undertaken by colonial administrators in order to better govern their colonial subjects and migrant populations. Sometimes they enlist the help of locals and migrants. Sometimes these locals and migrants do translations by themselves, for themselves, right? So I'll start off with the 19th century, the kinds of translation projects that happen in China and in Malaysia. And then I'll move on to 20th century translation projects in Hong Kong, the US, via the US or US agencies, and Malaya. So I'll bring in writers like Eileen Chang, Bai Yao, who is a Mahwah writer, and Baran, who is a writer from China, but he lived in Indonesia and participated in the Indonesian nationalist revolution in the late 40s. Okay, and then I would very briefly talk about reading practices. So the famous writer Sisi or Sai Sai in Cantonese, and her influence on a Mahwah writer by the name of Fang Lu. And Fang Lu is interesting because he's from the region, the northern region of the Malaya Peninsula, Bukit Mertajam, which used to be a transit hub for tin mining. Okay, so here I'll pick up some of the ideas from yesterday's talk on Sabah by Dr. David Saunders. He mentioned rubber, tobacco, deforestation, land degradation, and issues of labor, dispossession, and ideas of access to actual land. So I'm trying to continue this theme of ecologies as they pertain to the artist Yilan's work. All right, so the first section, theory, right? I want to think of the Hong Kong novelist Liu Yichang in terms of a poetics of relation and in terms of inter-imperiality. I will explain these terms later. So 2646, right? And In the Mood for Love. These are two movies by the Hong Kong director Wong Kar-wai. They have entered the popular imagination for depicting a particular time and space of Hong Kong, old Hong Kong, as well as the future Hong Kong. And they're actually based on the writer Liu Yichang's novels, The Drunkard and Intersection, respectively. So here are the book covers of the books I mentioned. I want to mention that the Hong Kong writer Liu Yichang moved between places. He was born in Shanghai. He came to Hong Kong in 1948. In 1952, he moved from Hong Kong to Singapore, and he worked in Singapore as an editor for Yi Shi Bao. He also worked in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia as an editor-in-chief for Federation Daily. And in 1957, he returned to Hong Kong. So this experience of living in Malaysia and Singapore influenced his novels. So let's look at an excerpt from The Drunkard. Oops. So this is a novel about a drunk narrator who is a writer who wants to write more than just popular fiction, right? He wants to write more than pulp fiction, martial arts fiction. He wants to be a serious literary writer. To become world famous, he often thinks about his Chinese identity in relation to world literature. He is in the modernist experimental camp. He wants to update his writing so that he's not a fuddy-duddy traditionalist writer who writes in what he considers old classical forms. But he notes the irony that these classical Chinese forms sometimes endear themselves to or appeal to non-Chinese tastes and become celebrated as world literature. So he's kind of mocking and ironic or sarcastic even about how he approaches the structuring relations of Chinese writing to world literature. But I want to, introduce this passage that highlights Chinese diaspora and the history of labor movement. I'll read the passage right now. But why stop at that? Why not send 30 delegations to the next international conference? Apart from the two I just mentioned, we could send delegations representing the Chinese writers of Malaysia, Singapore, Borneo, Brazil, Panama, Guatemala, South Africa, Canada, Trinidad, Peru, and so on and so forth. And afterwards, we can instruct the 18 members of the Swedish Academy to award the Nobel Prize to a Chinese writer of 8-legged doggerel essays. Okay, so I want to draw your attention to the list in this passage. Why does Liu Yichang name all of these countries, right? I suggest that it is part of his idea of a colonial economy on a global stage, right? You think of Chinese labor migration and diaspora, the kind of center-peripheral relations between Hong Kong and Southeast Asia in the global literary economy. These are some kinds of ideas being proposed here. So in other parts of this novel, The Drunkard, there are figures of exile and internal migration, writers, publishers, intellectuals who had to move because of war. They occupy the same space as sex workers and ballroom singers, barroom singers. So now you can guess, oops. Now you can guess why I'm calling my talk a Poetics of Relation, right? I'm trying to think about Hong Kong and Malaysia as transitory spaces, not places where people settle down, but where Hong Kong and Malaysia are places or where laborers get processed at the ports before they're shipped elsewhere to work. So it's part of one node of the global economy and global literature, right? So Poetics of Relation is the title of a book by the French Caribbean poet-philosopher Edouard Glissant. In this book, he revisits the legacy of colonialism in the Caribbean and its post-plantation economy to come up with philosophical concepts of relating to these histories as well as the world. So one of the concepts he introduces is opacity, right? 不透明性, right? Which is to say there's not one linear relationship or cause and effect between incidents. So this is a good reminder that the traffic between Hong Kong and Malaysia is not a direct relationship, right? Here I'm trying to propose a different relationality between Hong Kong and Malaysia. It is not a one-way influence, a one-way movement of people, goods, or ideas. So for example, Hong Kong did not just export Cantonese drama and martial arts movies to Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the 1990s, for example. Although that is one part of the story, it appeals to a certain diasporic audience, but I don't think it's the only determining way in which we can think of Hong Kong and Southeast Asia together. So today I'll try to open up a few ways of thinking about the movement and the influence between Hong Kong and Malaysia. My examples will be historical, but they can also be a poetic one. I'll next introduce Laura Doyle's idea of inter-imperiality. So in this book, she says that she defines inter-imperiality, or rather in one of the essays called Thinking Back Through Empires, she says, in all cases, authors not only write back to or negotiate a relation to one empire, but they negotiate a position between and among empires. So what is crucial here is the idea of between and among empires. And so one way I think to push maybe Sinophone studies or scholars writing about Liu Yichang, for example, is to see Liu Yichang as a writer who moves between spaces of the British Empire, not only in his works, but also in person, but how his writing also responds to other empires, right? Second, I'll talk about the colonial economy in Malaysia. I'll bring in inter-imperial coolie trade, as well as the Delhi plantation estates. And mind you, the Delhi plantation estates is an interesting way for me to go beyond the national boundary of present-day Malaysia. I could always talk about tin and rubber as a commodity and the forces it exerts on the peninsula, but I think it'd be more interesting to examine a kind of cross-straits relationship between Penang and Medan, for example. I'll talk more about this later. So to begin with, let's look at Peninsula Malaysia during colonial times, then known simply as Malaya. The picture on the right illustrates this. It is a mineral map of the Malay Peninsula, so stretching from Myanmar through Thailand and Malaysia down to Singapore. This area is known for its rich tin deposits. So as research has shown, geological resources determine how people moved into this part of the world. Histories of migration and of writing are thus connected to what's cultivated and extracted from the earth. So Chinese migrated to tin mines and rubber plantations to fund the colonial economy. These mines and plantations became a common setting and framework for Chinese language writers in Malaysia to write about. So Mahwah writers tend to write about these issues. Just to address the historiography of Southeast Asia a little bit, right? So Nanyang, which translates as Southern Seas, is thought of as an equivalent word for Southeast Asia now. And so in the Nanyang historiography, they emphasize the importance of maritime trade, where the archetypal cultural goods like porcelain are already formed, they're already complete. We can think of this differently, right? Migration to Southeast Asia is not simply about commodity goods and their transport over waterways, but perhaps even more so about the raw material and the land that it is extracted from. So these mineral resources have no cultural stamp or significance until they are given some kind of meaning. So let's move beyond seafaring and follow the extractive industries for a second. So extraction as part of taking something of the soil, right? Recently, I got interested in literature about tobacco plantations in the Dutch East Indies. In particular, there's this myth of the 5 Chinese coolies and their execution in 1871 for murdering a Dutch foreman in a Delhi tobacco plantation in East Sumatra. So Delhi has a bad reputation in China for exploiting its workers. You go there and you might never come back. You know, people try to escape to Penang, but they're often repatriated to the farms or the estates because of the lack of legal protection. So you certainly didn't want to be kidnapped or tricked into working in these plantations. And sometimes there have been documented episodes where coolies who think they are settling down in Singapore jump off the ships because it's later revealed that they're being shipped off to Delhi, right? So you don't want to be taken out against your own will, or what they call 卖猪仔, right? 卖猪仔 from Fujian or Guangdong, which are places in southern China where laborers would mostly start their journey. So as you see in this picture, there was a temple built to celebrate these 5 coolies as deities. They were seen as martyrs. So there's a local cult that appears in both the Strait settlements, now in Malaysia, and Medan, now in Indonesia. So how did this actually happen? Where was this these cults happening on both sides of the straits? So to look at this map, laborers were recruited from Penang, from Singapore, so the Strait settlements, then ruled by the British, and they were sent across the water to Medan in East Sumatra to work in the Delhi tobacco plantations. So East Sumatra gradually became under Dutch rule after the Aceh War. You know, they're ruling from Batavia, which is present-day Jakarta. And so this Anglo-Dutch migration corridor, or the cross-straits coolie trade, was bypassed in the 1880s when the Dutch were able to recruit laborers directly from South China. So to the dismay of the Chinese brokers or Chinese middlemen working in the Strait settlement, they lost the business, right? So I'll give you a little bit of migration history because I think it's important for the study of literature, right? And I'm giving you this idea of the coolie trade in an inter-imperial framework, so rather than a national framework. So the Treaty of 1871, it demarcated the Anglo-Dutch border between Penang and Medan. And so both sides began to regulate the number, the types of Chinese labor leaving British control Malay Peninsula and entering Dutch Sumatra. And so drawing on the lessons of British plantation ambitions in Sri Lanka and Mauritius a few decades ago, where there were promoters of British liberalism, right, in the Strait settlements, because the British were all about free labor, anti-slavery on paper, right? And so they sought to protect British subjects who nominally included coolies by setting up what is called the Chinese Protectorate in 1877. And so this is, I think, you could think about it as a system of surveillance, of limiting their movement of across different places. It is definitely a modern instrument of control, right? Next, so when indentured Chinese migration to South America was abolished in 1874, Southeast Asia absorbed this labor supply, and the Delhi tobacco plantations was one such place that laborers went to. So I also mentioned just now that in the 1880s, Dutch planters bypassed Chinese brokers in the Strait settlements to directly solicit coolies from Qing China with the help of German shipping companies. And this involved Dutch sinologists as well. And this really interesting history, you can read it from a recent undergrad thesis by an Indonesian at Yale University, Gregory Yani, Jany. And Yani draws on the insights of Anthony Reid, who's a historian of Southeast Asia, to consider the Penang, Medan migrant labor connection, right? So I'll come back to this history when I talk about the writer Paren, who is from China, but who lived in Medan, Indonesia. Here, I just want to say that Hong Kong and Malaysia, even though they don't sound like they're part of, the map, or like not so obviously, right? But I want to say that they were part of this global coolie trade and it was influenced by laws and events happening elsewhere. So we have to take a view of global history to understand what is going on in Malaysia and in Hong Kong. So for example, the famous incident of Feng Xiaowei, so the life and death of a worker in Mexico who was refused entry into the US, this incident really resonated with people in Hong Kong, in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and in Singapore, in Manila, in Canton. This history is documented by Tim Harper in his new book, I think called Revolutionary Asia. And so the implications of one place, are picked up in another. So I'm trying to suggest that British Malaya and Hong Kong were part of a global economy and global literary history. All right, so moving on to what I want to talk about now is translation projects in the British Empire. So I'll start with 19th century translation projects and then move on to 20th century translation projects, which are probably more familiar with all of you, because they involve writers, very favorite writers of us, Eileen Chang, a totally obscure writer, Bai Yao, whom I wrote a dissertation chapter on, and Paren. So before I talk about translation projects by Eileen Chang and Bai Yao in the mid-20th century in spaces like British Hong Kong and British Malaya, I think it's important to go back to the post-Opium War period in Qing history. So let's start with a few examples of English-Chinese translation from China and British Malaya from the angles of transnational, or from the angles of international law and governance. So I think Lydia Liu's work in translation studies and literary studies is helpful. Her book, The Clash of Empires, tracks international law and political projects that were taking place in Shanghai and Beijing. On the China seaboard, defining what is Chineseness, what is the Chinese place in international law seems very important to the British Empire. These projects were very well funded, in contrast to G.T. Hare's textbook, which I'll introduce in my next slide. So in this small section, I'm trying to rethink the international role of English-Chinese translations from a minor position, right? To trace the formation of maybe Chinese literary subjects in Malaya as imperial subjects on the margins of empire. So we know that some parts of Malaya were at first governed from a distance from the India office, and they played a secondary role to Chinese-British relations. But Mahwah's role on the periphery of the world economy and international relations, I argue, created Mahwah literature's minor relation to state and market pressures. So Mahwah literature is subject to a translingual practice, to use Lydia Liu's term, on the history of power relations mediated by translation into Chinese, except it's aimed at creating a minor rather than a national literature, which is what Lydia is writing about. So in the tropical heat, in the sleepy town next to tin mines and rubber plantations in Malaya, G.T. Hare, the so-called protector of Chinese, he compiled this textbook of documentary Chinese. And unlike translators in 19th century China, G.T. Hare could not get the foreign colonial office to fund and publish his volumes. Since they were only about property and family law for the Straits Chinese in Malaya and not China. So published in Singapore in 1894, G.T. Hare's textbook was used to train colonial officers to deal with a new kind of Chinese person, unlike the ones they learned about in London or China. These Chinese were from Sanzhoufu, the first 3 Chinese characters on the cover page. So Sanzhoufu refers to the 3 ports of Singapore, Penang, and Malacca, together known as the Straits Settlements. Here and in other native states, colonial officers and Chinese themselves, they faced the issue of so many spoken languages, which was difficult for governance. So this textbook, all written in classical Chinese, included a variety of documents. There were edicts from the Chinese government, local news, business contracts, disputes, and even my favorite is a complaint about a daughter who had been kidnapped by an opera group. The picture on the right is an indenture, meaning a contract of selling oneself or a member of one's family. So it's remarkable that only this year, these scattered documents were published in full for the first time by a Malaysian publisher. So I'll give a little bit of background on the linguistic dilemma of consolidating a kind of Chineseness in Malaysia. So this map you see is a geographical distributions of ethnicity across the Malay Peninsula as well as East Malaysia, so Sabah and Sarawak. So how does colonial governance of diverse languages relate to Mahwah literature? Mahwah literature is written in Chinese, but it has often struggled to define its native language, right? There's a disconnect between written Chinese and oral communication, which could take place in any or in a combination of Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka, Teochew, and Hainanese. So the 5 major Chinese languages in Malaya. But there was also communication happening in Mandarin, in English, Malay, Tamil, and Punjabi. So native language seems like a functional concept, and it's based on what is needed to communicate in different settings, from the marketplace and family gatherings to business settings. Straits Chinese, with their mastery of English, Malay, and Hokkien, they could get jobs in colonial offices and mediate between colonial officers, natives, and migrant populations alike. While the new migrants from China, workers and capitalists at the mines and plantations, they had very little English to work with. So their Chineseness was a distinguishing feature, later linked to anti-Japanese and anti-colonial resistance activities. So the colonial British used the term Chinese to consolidate language and ethnicity of Mahwah subjects. Teachers from China also started to use Mandarin, known as Guoyu, or national language, as the medium of instruction, in line with China's national language movement from the 1920s. Such responses to Mahwah's lack of a native language make writers want to create and even define a native form that is probably untranslatable. And so I suggest that when you are living in colonial Malaya, the Mahwah person always exists between languages and between phenomenons, and they're a subject in translation. So in this section, I'll move on to writers from the mid-20th century, finding the places they live in, such as Hong Kong and Malaysia, drawn into the complex situation of having to take sides during the Cold War. Not sure why it's not loading, right? Okay, so now in the 1950s, right, the Cold War, or this period of hostility between Soviet bloc countries and Western powers, the Cold War was raging, and British Hong Kong was a similar battleground of ideas and a conduit for propaganda on both sides. So you might know of the famous British author George Orwell. His book Animal Farm was widely translated into Chinese and Southeast Asian languages thanks to its strident anti-Stalinist message. In fact, Hong Kong facilitated the successful distribution of this Chinese translation of Animal Farm in Southeast Asia. And I remember having to read Animal Farm in secondary school in Singapore as I think a secondary 2 text for literature. So you can see the vast implications of it, and I'm sure it's being picked up right now elsewhere to speak to certain conditions too. And so the writer on the screen, Eileen Chang, known as a famous writer of Chinese literature, was also a bilingual writer who participated in propaganda efforts by the USIS, so the United States Information Service, based in Hong Kong, to write novels and to publish English translations of Chinese novels. I won't go into detail here, but if you look more closely at the publication histories in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong, I think it's less clear-cut that it was really always a Cold War, or the Cold War allowed for other kinds of activities. So what other materials were present, right? The overseas Chinese publications, there were works about coolies. So if you look at the historians Claudine Salmon's work, her research documents the kinds of publications by overseas Chinese who returned from Southeast Asia to Hong Kong or to the mainland, and some of their works were published in Hong Kong, and they were documenting the Dutch East Indies. So for example, this writer Dong Rui published a book in Hong Kong, but he wrote about the Dutch East Indies. Huang Dongping's foam script was published in Hong Kong. And even though he has a background in Indonesia. So clearly there was some kind of movement and activity happening here. And I won't go into detail, but during this period, there were a lot of foam scripts and books about the Nanyang, all from the Nanyang that were published in Hong Kong. So there was definitely interest in this region. Okay, so I'll move on to a lesser known figure by the name of Bai Yao. Bai Yao is a pen name, but he was doing something similar to Eileen Chang, right? But he was commissioned to do it in Southeast Asia. So he actually did editorial work for Chao Fun magazine, Jiao Feng. And he was based in Hong Kong, but he was sent to Malaya to set up reading camps or reading groups based around his journal. And there have been articles written about how Chao Fun has received money from USIS to publish its material. But the question is how much were they dictated by US policies and how much were they, how much free rein were they given to publish their own material? And I think the literary critic Shen Shuang has written about this. And so you know, Baya was really thinking about you know, how to integrate or assimilate into Malaysia. So he was learning Malay and translating, you know, from very rudimentary Malay into translating Chinese into very rudimentary Malay, and also trying to organize literary activity in Malaya according to Cold War politics. And And so I'm very intrigued by why this magazine is called Jiao Feng, right? Sometimes there's a kind of romanticism about the tropics. They tend to focus on nature, but I think if you turn to the writer, Byron, who is a Chinese literary critic that became an ambassador for the PRC to Indonesia in the 50s, but it was a very brief stint. He went back very quickly, but because of his experience of witnessing and participating in the Indonesian nationalist revolution, and also advocating for Indonesia's national independence, he wrote this historical drama based on the myth of the five coolies. So it's called the Temple of Five Ancestors. And so I think scholars have recently read this historical drama as a way of asserting Byron's Third World solidarity as part of pre-Suharto and post-Bandung Indonesian China diplomacy. They mentioned his socialist realist writing, that the fact that he was an undercover Chinese Communist Party agent who staged this Marxist play to shore up left-wing support in an ideological contest with Chinese nationalists in Medan. This is in the words of Yanis. But when I looked at this text, I was really intrigued that there were a lot of moments where the national heroes and the anti-colonial martyrs of the play actually couches or like has a different critique underneath it. So what do I mean? Byron also has an ecological critique of extractive capitalism in this play. So he pays attention to two events that were going on, right? So I mentioned the five coolies who murdered a Dutch plantation manager in 1971. They were executed on the Sultan's orders. But then later on, the Aceh War was happening for several decades after, and there were a lot of revolts, not just by Chinese coolies, but also migrant laborers such as Javanese, but also the Gayos who lived in the highlands, the indigenous Malays, the Bataks who were living in the regions, the same region, that there were a lot of murders happening of plantation managers. So these were happening around 1876. And a really important event that the anthropologist Anne Stoller has analyzed. So Anne Stoller has talked about the murder of the plantation owner J. Luman. So Luman, his family was tragically murdered and by Gayos and Malays. But interestingly, in Byron's play, he combines these two events in the same space, that they happen simultaneously, and it's an interesting sort of, you can say that there's a kind of solidarity happening, that he's sort of defining the to be Indonesian nation and putting indigenous and migrant subjects in the same space, and critiquing colonial capitalism together, right? But I think a more interesting thing that happens in Byron's play is that he goes into, in his preface, he goes into a whole history of how the Delhi plantations, tobacco plantations, were set up in the first place, right? So the Sultan leased land out to the Dutch plantation managers, and so there was encroaching Dutch colonialism, but the five Cooley's case was the turning point, right? It was an alibi, which means that it was an excuse for the colonial government in Batavia to institute Dutch extraterritoriality in East Sumatra, right? They felt that the Sultan's death penalty was too harsh. The Sultan's court executed the Chinese migrants whose jurisdiction it did not cover. So plantation managers were angry that the colonial government stepped in. And so Byron, in his play, sort of has a dialogue between local and Chinese men about whose fault is it? Is it the Sultan's fault to give out the land in the first place? Or is it the fault of the Dutch colonial government or the plantation managers? And so I think Byron is very sensitive to the minute details of inter-imperial history and its ecological transformations happening in the tobacco plantations. And I didn't have time to put up this on the screen, but towards the end of the play, Byron translates a lot of Indonesian folk songs or poetry and renders them into Chinese. And in the play, there are certain characters, Malay characters who sing Chinese songs that come from Penang. So all the way from the Strait settlements, they come with the Chinese coolies to the Delhi plantations. And then they modify the songs, not to sing about the beautiful scenery of Penang, but really to talk about the harsh conditions of Delhi. And similarly, there's also Chinese laborers who sing Malay pantuns and songs. And so I think to use the anthropologist Fernando Ortiz, his word transculturation, which means that whoever comes into contact is transformed on both sides, right? So there's a kind of transculturation of art and labor happening because of tobacco, right? You see Chinese and Malay songs coming together and becoming something else. So I'll end my presentation on a little vignette about this Hong Kong writer's influence on a Malaysian writer by the name of Fang Lu. Fang Lu was a migrant worker in Taiwan, and he worked in the construction industry, but in one of his books, he mentions the influence of Cici or Sai Sai on his creative writing. And so I'd like to draw your attention to Cici or Sai Sai's idea of labor. And she has this passage in the Hong Kong story of My City, where a sailor wanders around as part of his job, which gives you a sense of her art making and her sense of a relation to the world. So sailors who travel around the world leave the port of Hong Kong, but they notice what's happening elsewhere. I'll read the quote, right? The ship sailed past Tampa, past Cuba, and skirted Panama. Swim, the character, saw that the sea there was dotted with yachts and fishing boats. And then the ship passed the West Indies and Trinidad, sailing along Brazil's long coastline past El Salvador. At this moment, the ship is at Santos, replenishing its oil and drinking water supply. As Swim stands on deck, he can see a distant city floating in the black night. It is a city on the sea decorated with numerous lights. Is it my city? Is it my city? Swim cries out loud. And so Swim is from Hong Kong, but the disorienting effects of not knowing his home, or whether his home is actually on the seas, is captured by this beautiful passage. And I really enjoyed Cici's attention to plantation economies in the Caribbean, in South America, and also in other parts of the world in this book. And so I think to conceptualize Hong Kong not just as a space of like East-West and mediating between English and Chinese relations is important because novelists themselves also think of movement out of Hong Kong and back through other spaces. All right, and so I thought it would be interesting to put a photo of Sai Sai's own teddy bears. She after her surgery, she couldn't use one of her hands, but she really wanted to pick up sewing projects, and this was one of them, to sew teddy bears. And she writes sort of responses to classical Chinese literary history by making teddy bears after these literary figures, and also writing about them. So thinking about the histories of labor and the histories of art making in the same space, right? And finally, Fang Lu, I mentioned, who lives in Bukit Mertajam, Da Shanjiao, which is a transport hub for tin mining in Malaya. I think he has a different sense of writing from quite a few of the Mahwah writers who are famous in Taiwan, right? The sense of projecting local space. It's not really about the jungle, but really boils down to his personal experience as a laborer, as a construction worker, or as someone who is disenfranchised and growing up in the ex-tin mining area. And so I think I've been quite pointillistic in my approach to presenting this history of labor and history of art making together. But I'm thinking, why am I revisiting this idea of a Nanyang plantation system, or even the Anglo-Dutch migration corridor between Penang and Medan, as we're experiencing COVID, right? And when borders are closed and commodity chains and labor markets are disrupted, my response is that these moments in history remind us that Mahwah, which is a Malaysian Chinese, is just a small point or a node in the global economy. It is a point of access that receives, that recreates, that re-exports literary ideas and myths, that it's not constrained, not stopped by national boundaries on origins. So I'm trying to revisit a kind of plural inter-imperial context in which Malaya emerged on the literary map by way of its material significance for commodity production for the world market. And so happens Hong Kong is part of this story. I'll stop here, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Could you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, so we've got, we'll go into a Q&A session right now. If audiences have any questions, please enter them in the chat box. We do have a question in the chat box right now. Perhaps I'll read it word for word, this one. It is interesting to note that Hokkien is widely spoken throughout Peninsular Malaya then. Is this because most of the Chinese coolies / migrants were from the Fujian province, and why?
Right, I guess the waves of Chinese migration really depends on which ports were open, where people could move freely. And so to give an answer very briefly, yes, a lot of Chinese coolies were from the Fujian province. I mean, some also came from Guangdong province. And a recent book by Melissa, I think Macaulay, called Distant Shores, tracks the history of Teochew, so Qiuzhao migration, and its intrepid travelers, how they define world trade and the global economy, and also the Chinese coolie trade involving Teochews. And Teochews, a lot of them resettled in Thailand. And so I think really a historian will be able to tell you more specifically like which region certain ethnicities come from and where they settled. And also, certain Hokkien, so the will sound differently elsewhere. So the Penang and Medan Hokkien would probably sound more similar because of this Anglo-Dutch migration corridor, right? So just a very a brief response to your question.
Thank you. Okay, another question right here. This is very interesting. I'm reading this word for word again. I know your focus is on literature, but I want to know more about the circulation of other artistic forms among the region, other kinds of modern expression, any other focus that you have. I know, for example, Dr. Wong, you mentioned films earlier.
Right, so between Hong Kong and Malaysia, because of the large Cantonese speaking population, a lot of them are, well, I would say susceptible, but also really open to watching Cantonese drama, films from Hong Kong, right? And so there's that connection that has been eclipsed now for various reasons. Thinking of Hong Kong's place on the global stage. Yeah, I mean, it is quite a vague question, so I don't really know how to address it.
Maybe one question that I have to follow up on this is In the Mood for Love. Let's maybe talk about that film. Very famous film. I guess people associate it with almost like at this point a classically Hong Kong film. A film like that, how is this something that you have brought up in your classes, or how should we approach watching a film like that? Perhaps through the lens of Mahwah, or perhaps through the lens of the original, The Drunkard?
Yeah, well, it is interesting. I think students can look at the parts of In the Mood for Love where the central character travels to Singapore, and I think he lives in maybe Chinatown or in search of his lover, if I'm not mistaken, and he stays in a hostel, and he probably encounters some Malay there and some local customs, and so how Wong Kar-wai as a filmmaker decides to depict a sense of Malaysia, right? But I think the character quickly goes back to Hong Kong when he is in fails to locate his lover. But I think the film, if I'm not mistaken, ends with an enigmatic image of Southeast Asia, right? The ruins of some long gone empire. I'm not sure it's Cambodia or where, but
I think the Angkor Wat.
Angkor Wat, yes, and also the sort of the passing of hands from, I think, a colonial government to one of the nationalist governments, right? And so all these intertextual moments are probably interesting for students to open their eyes and say, what is Wong Kar-wai trying to say? You know, what is this quintessentially Hong Kong movie trying to say about Hong Kong's relationship to Southeast Asia? And it's definitely not limited to, Chinese coolies trying to find work in Southeast Asia, get stranded, get deported to, or get sent to Delhi to work on the tobacco plantations. But I think there's a lot going on. You know, this is a writer's intellectual's perspective of the region.
Thank you for that. Another question that I will read word for word, this one. Can you expand a bit about how journals like Jiao Feng were effective in apparent Cold War contexts in uncertain regions, sorry. How literate did readers or audiences have to be persuaded one way or another?
So how literate did readers and audiences have to be persuaded one way or another? Yeah, that's a very fascinating question about persuasion, about leadership and what is assigned in schools, and the kinds of reading clubs that happened in Chinese schools after class, and whether students get together to attend camps on their own volition, right? Or not just attend like a Bible camp and read these texts together. But in Bios, so going back to the writer that I studied, I think he presents a very optimistic version of how everyone was on the side of, I think, the US side of the Cold War, right? So they liked modernist works. They were anti-Stalinist, so they read Animal Farm. They read Boris Pasternak. They were upset about the Soviet clampdown of Czechoslovakia, and then they had a debate. And I think he documents certain Malay intellectuals and Chinese intellectuals in the public forum in Singapore, and how communism is bad. So basically that version of history to Payao is quite clear cut for him, right? But maybe the ideological context is more complex, right, than that. And so I think Chao Fun sort of filled a space for writers to write in Chinese in Singapore and Malaysia and other parts of Southeast Asia. They could contribute their own writing as students. They could read things translated from elsewhere into Chinese. We know this for a fact because there was the anti-communist clamdowns in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the American war in Vietnam, sort of put people's affinities very differently. And so Chao Fun filled a space in sort of trying to be a middle ground, almost anti-political, but also probably ideologically inflected.
That's very interesting, the idea of a middle ground, because what stood out to me earlier in your presentation was, I think it's a popular understanding that places like Hong Kong, for example, are these conduits or places of transitory places, also places in translation. But you mentioned something about taking sides, and I thought that was interesting. That I don't know if it's like because it evades certain market forces. I know you also briefly mentioned that, or market influences, or what it is, but there is this element of taking sides. I wonder if that's a sort of pressure that as a sort of minor literature for Mahwah has to face. We have another question on that, on the issue of minor literature in the question box right now. Is that something maybe you could speak a little bit about Mahwah in relation to the idea of peripheries, centers, and taking sides?
Oh yeah, I like your idea of taking sides, especially when minor literature in the conventional definition in comparative literature, right? When they draw on the concept of the minor, it comes from Deleuze and Guattari reading Kafka, and they often the scholars often define minority or minor as ethnicity or language, that's subject to marginalization. But to think about minor as a kind of contestation, as part of global forces, or like against market forces, or a critique of political economy, that's also a form of a minor, right? I mean, like, so I think in my work, Mahwah literature, that there's a lot of opportunities to expand on a different concept of the minor. So just to briefly answer that.
Thank you. So we have an interesting question that I'm actually, this one, maybe Nicholas, we could look at it together because there are some terms that I cannot pronounce properly. This one, it refers to Yanni's thesis. So Greg Yanni's thesis really is amazing. It struck me that literature is just one way in which forms circulate. For one, architecture. I think this refers to the brief section on temples. And it goes on to ask, intertextual readings can perhaps also exist beyond the text, question mark. Not sure if you found anything interesting, maybe in the intertwining of both forms, writings on temples. Not really a question, I suppose, more of a thought, but I suppose this question is asking about interrelationships between literature and other forms of cultural production, I suppose, maybe.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's absolutely fascinating comment. Thank you. And I'm glad that you also read Yanni's thesis and found it amazing. It's quite a fascinating read, and I sat down and finished it in one sitting. And I think I'm not so well equipped to answer a question about the relationship between literature and architecture. But I think there is work to be done in how the five coolies myth, for example, you know, there's the form of the temple, right, where there's a kind of institutional memory of the event happening. And then there's the text where Baron and other writers write about the myth of the five coolies, right? And I noticed in Baron's text, in his preface, he instructed his friend to go to Medan personally to search historical details of the five coolies so that he could actually write about this history accurately. But then he decides to also have an imaginative leap and bring in the Luman murders that happened 5 years later. And so literature has its own creative ways of synthesizing a historical event. I think religious, Chinese folk religion also has its own spaces, has its own inter-imperial boundaries and inter-imperial crossings, and that it navigates. So I think preliminary, I think the difference here is between an artifact where you can go and see a temple, right, and like pay pilgrimage to the shrine of the five coolies, versus the text where maybe it's hidden in an archive and it's hard to find. And so this kind of intertextuality that you're talking about is really to make sense of both spaces, make the literary text speak to an architectural history, and also let the solid, what we perceive as very solid histories, come alive when we read the literary text.
Thanks for that. One commenter actually asks to follow up on a previous question they also asked. It's going back to the other art forms question. How, apart from modern literature, did other art form, for example, folk art, was circulated across cultures in the region? Would that also be a kind of inter-imperiality or translingual practice?
Can you point me to where it is on the chat?
This one is in it's the latest question that we have. I think maybe it's also a question to expound a little bit on the notion of inter-imperiality, and maybe perhaps how it's not limited to modern literature, if you've come upon those in your research.
Right, I think in what's the name? Oh gosh, I already forgot. Laura Doyle's concept of inter-imperiality, right? When she talks about empire, she wants to sort of go back in time for a millennia and discover different empires and how they interact with each other for thousands of years, and to think about intertextuality on an expanded scale in time and space. And so to answer you, Bruce, it's not just a modern text, right? I mean, she has examples, James Joyce and other things, but really she wants to do what the literary scholar is probably afraid to do, which is to go back to millennia and also be conversant and fluent in other kinds of cultures. So I don't know if that addressed the question really.
I think so. Thank you for that. So we still will welcome more questions if they're coming. I want to go back to an earlier question in the chat box. There is a sense of, I'm going to paraphrase this one. This one is a little bit about Mahwah or other forms of literature. You spoke a little bit about duality and vagueness. Actually, maybe this is a good transition for us. Is this something you've experienced in your own creative practice in poetry? Is that something you play around with?
Yes, I tend to gravitate and move towards opaque and opaque art forms or opaque forms of expression, because I think poetic language, simple or difficult is always hard to grasp and is open to different meanings. But when I do research on something, I tend to want to study a history in depth and study it properly, so that I can write about it. Sometimes I even footnote my poems just so that people can go back to the event and look at it, right? So I don't know. I'm just going off tangent, but I guess maybe this is a question to think about form, right? What is poetic form? Is it rhythm? Do people just look at a rhyme and just the motions of a beat to think about form, or is a poetic form more capacious and larger to accommodate different kinds of ideas? And I think as a Malaysian person living in Hong Kong and also trying to think about, well, let's throw in the US, right? So spaces of ex-British colonies, right? And so can I think of my personal experience in these spaces as a kind of exploration of poetic form? And I haven't come to a conclusion about that, but I think maybe that, now that I'm in Hong Kong, it's also a good time to explore poetic form in different ways. Yeah.
How are we able to access your work, actually, your poetry?
I have, there is a chapbook that is online, the Elite Press website. My second chapbook, See Hypocrisy, is sold out. But if you're interested, I can send you, excerpts of it, and I can point you to a journal online that has its contents. And my forthcoming chapbook, what's it called? The Geometry of Trees, is forthcoming from a US publisher. They're printing in Portugal, but I think it's going to come out anytime soon. So it's about trees. I explore trees and desire. So the relationship of these two things. I wonder why, as a young poet, I've often written about trees, and I noticed that it is a metaphor for me to think about desire. And so for me, like, am I shortchanging trees? Am I giving trees enough due? Am I thinking about the natural history of trees, or just using trees as a symbol for something else? Is what the chapbook is concerned about.
Thank you. We have the perfect question coming in. This one says, can you read to us one of your poems?
I don't have any in front of me now, actually.
Oh, that's all right then. Maybe next time. Next time we'll do that. Well, I just want to maybe wrap things up a little bit. Thank you everyone for listening in this evening. I want to give particular thanks, of course, to Dr. Wong. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your insights into the idea of labor, actually, personally. I think that's very interesting. It relates to, I mean, it's expansive. You're not talking about physical labor. The way you linked it to Xixi, for example, is fascinating. And the way we don't look at art and think of labor in the same way that we think of work. So thank you for that. And it strongly relates to our exhibition that we have on a chat right now. So I also appreciate that connection to us.